This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. If you click on the link in the description below, it'll take you to their store and they'll know I sent you there.
From Innistrad to Shadowmoor, what spooky top 10 does Nitsuhone have in store?
I'm Nitsuhone, and it's time for another MTG Top 10, the series where I rank cards based on their historical performance at Magic's highest level of competition. As you probably gathered from the intro, this is a Halloween-themed MTG Top 10, and in this one, we'll be looking at rats. Rats are one of my favorite creature types in Magic because they're also one of my favorite creature types in real life. While they are a somewhat maligned animal, this is mostly because of misconceptions about them. For example, they're better at keeping themselves clean than dogs are. They're also really intelligent and affectionate animals. This makes them really good pets. But those misconceptions have made rats fairly popular as Halloween decorations. Right now, we have 3 pet rats, and we always tend to have a few. Generally, my wife and I adopt older ones that aren't going to find homes, because rats only live 2 or 3 years. So if one gets taken to a shelter, it's very unlikely to be rescued because it just doesn't have that much time left. Anytime I talk about our rats, people ask me if there's an Amazon wish list, so I actually made sure there was one this time. If you'd like to help us take care of our older rats we adopt, I did set up an Amazon wish list so you can do exactly that. You can find a link in the description. Anyway, this isn't actually the first time I've done rats for the month of October. I did it 2 years ago too. Anyway, back to Magic. This isn't actually the first time I've done rats for the month of October. I did it 2 years ago too, but the last 2 years have featured 2 rat-heavy sets, Kamigawa Neon Dynasty and Wilds of Eldraine, both of which have really made this list change significantly. To be eligible for this list, a card had to have the rat creature type or make a rat creature token. In all, there were 101 cards eligible for this video, and in it we'll look at the 10 that have left the biggest impact on competitive Magic. As usual, in an update video, we'll also take a look at the cards that were on the list last time that didn't make it this time. Before we get started, here's a quick reminder on how I score cards in these videos. A first tier top 8 is worth 2 points. This includes events like Pro Tours, and a second tier top 8 is worth 1 point. This includes events like regional championships. Now then, let's take a look at the 4 cards that made the list in 2021, but didn't make it this time. First, there's Rotting Rats, which is at number 10 last time. For 1 generic and a black, it's a 1/1 that makes both players discard a card when it enters the battlefield. It also has Unearth for 1 generic and a black, which means it can come back from the graveyard for that cost. It gains haste and you exile it at the end of the turn. When you bring it back with Unearth, you get that enter the battlefield ability all over again, which is pretty sweet. As we'll see, a lot of rats in Magic make players discard cards. With Rotting Rats, the effect is symmetrical, forcing both players to discard. Generally, if you're the one playing the rats, you're playing the graveyard deck, so discarding a card won't hurt you a whole lot. The 1 point it has came in a Dredgevine deck in Modern in 2015. This was filled with ways to load the graveyard and creatures who could come back from it, so the rats were a good fit for the deck, but they never really became a regularly played card in it, and it hasn't gained any points since 2015. While just 1 point was enough to make the list last time, it took 6 this time, so I don't see Rotting Rats ever making its way back onto this list. Next, there's Nozumi's Short Fang, which was at number 8 last time. For 1 generic and a black, the Short Fang is a 1/1. You can tap it and pay 1 generic and a black to make your opponent discard a card, and then if your opponent has no cards in hand, you flip Nozumi's Short Fang. When you do, it becomes a legendary 3/3 rat, Stab Whisker the Odious, and at the beginning of each opponent's upkeep, that player loses 1 life for each card fewer than 3 in their hand. This flip design is from Kamigawa block, and flavor and function-wise, it's very similar to double-face cards that would be introduced several years later. The Short Fang gained both its top 8s at the Kamigawa block Pro Tour, but it doesn't have any points since 2005. Next, there's Okiba Gang Shinobi, which was at number 7 last time. This rat costs 3 generic and 2 black for a 3/2, and when it does combat damage to a player, that player discards 2 cards. It also comes with Ninjutsu for 2 generic and a black, which means if you have the Shinobi in your hand and you have a creature get through unblocked, you can pay this cost and put the Shinobi into play tapped and attacking, while returning the unblocked creature to your hand. Obviously, this coming in out of nowhere and eating 2 cards from your opponent's hand can be pretty awesome. It gained all of its points in the Standard of 2006, where it appeared in black aggro decks, but it doesn't have any points since then. There's also Rats of Wrath, which is at number 6 last time. For 1 generic and a black, you get a 2/1. You can pay 1 black to destroy target artifact, creature, or land you control. The rats may seem a bit unimpressive by today's standards, but in Tempest block constructed, a 2-mana 2/1 with upside was pretty reasonable. The upside here is pretty weird, since the rats can only blow up your own stuff, but the deck could actually put it to some good use. It used both Corpse Dance and Living Death, along with a bunch of creatures with Enter the Battlefield abilities, and the rats could help you set things up. It could just take out all your creatures and then Living Death could return them, or it could put a creature on top of your graveyard for Corpse Dance so you could rebuy the Enter the Battlefield ability. It hasn't gained any points outside of Tempest block constructed, but it was a pretty important card in that one very particular format. The last card to make the 2021 list that isn't on it this time is Burglar Rat, which was at number 5 last time. For 1 generic and a black, it's a 1/1, and when it enters the battlefield, each opponent discards a card. It was played in standard Orzhov Doom Foretold decks. These decks were really geared towards taking advantage of the eponymous enchantment, so playing anything that allowed you to take cards away from your opponent was welcome, since it would deprive them of resources even more ahead of Doom Foretold. Meanwhile, the rat provided good sacrifice fodder when Doom Foretold triggered on your turn, and the deck also used Yorion. And Burglar Rat's Enter the Battlefield ability could be rebought by Yorion. It doesn't have any points since rotating out of standard. Alright, let's move now to the list proper. At number 10, it's Mukai Ambusher, a card that didn't exist yet back in 2021. It's one of several cards on this list from Kamigawa Neon Dynasty. For 3 generic and a black, the Ambusher is a 3/2 artifact creature with lifelink. It also comes with ninjutsu for 1 generic and a black. It's gained all of its points in Pauper, a format in which only commons are legal. It's played there in Dimir fairy decks. While it isn't a fairy itself, it works quite well with cards like Spell Stutter Sprite, because ninjutsu lets you bounce a counterspell to your hand while cracking in for more damage and gaining some life. It's likely to keep gaining points in Pauper going forward. At number 9, it's Tribute to Harobi. For 1 generic and a black, this is a saga. That means it enters with a lore counter, and it gains another after your draw step each turn. Each lore counter triggers a chapter. Chapter 1 and 2 give your opponent a 1/1 rat token, and Chapter 3 transforms it into Echo of Death's Wail, a 3/3 with flying and haste, and when it enters the battlefield, you gain control of all rat tokens. Anytime it attacks, you can sack another creature, and if you do, you draw a card. Like most sagas, the efficiency on this card is pretty nuts. You pay 2 mana for a 3/3 with flying and haste and 2 1/1 tokens, plus upside. Obviously, it takes time to get going, and the first 2 chapters giving your opponent creatures isn't awesome, but the upside is definitely there. It's gained all of its points in Pioneer Transmogrify decks. This deck is built around casting that powerful sorcery to cheat Atraxa into play. Tribute is great for the deck, because it isn't a creature card, so you can't hit it with Transmogrify, yet it provides you with 3 bodies, all of which are potential things to target with Transmogrify. The deck always hits Atraxa when that happens, and it's pretty easy to win the game at that point. Tribute to Harobi is going to keep gaining points in Pioneer going forward. At number 8, it's Nozumi Grave Robber, which was at number 4 last time. For 1 generic and a black, this is a 2/1. And for 1 generic and a black, you can exile a card from an opponent's graveyard. And then, if there are no cards in that graveyard, it flips into Night Eyes the Desecrator, a legendary 4/2 rat with an activated ability that costs 4 generic and a black. It puts a creature card from a graveyard onto the battlefield under your control. Obviously, because of how this flips, your opponent won't have stuff in the graveyard right away, but you can reanimate from your own graveyard too, and sometimes you can just exile the 1 card your opponent has in the graveyard, flip the Grave Robber early on, and make it a huge problem for the rest of the game. It gained all of its points in Kamigawa block constructed. At number 7, it's Chittering Rats, a newcomer to the list, but not a new card. For 1 generic and 2 black, it's a 2/2, and when it enters the battlefield, target opponent puts a card from their hand on top of their library. While it isn't the same as forcing a discard, it does have a similar effect. Your opponent goes down a card. It makes the list this time around because now cards in this series can get points from Pauper, and Chittering Rats is amazing in that format. It sees play there in a variety of black decks, including Dimir control decks, which really look to abuse the Rats Enter the Battlefield ability with cards like Ghostly Flicker and Unearth. The deck can even get those back from the graveyard and keep on triggering Chittering Rats, and obviously that creates a soft lock because your opponent just draws the same card every turn. It's going to keep gaining points in Pauper. At number 6, it's Ravenous Rats, which was at number 3 last time. For one generic and a black, it's a 1/1 that makes your opponent discard a card when it enters the battlefield. It's had the benefit of being reprinted 6 times in standard legal sets, and it's impacted a variety of block and standard formats. It's a card that works pretty well as an early disruptive creature for aggro decks, and it also fits reasonably well in control decks that want card advantage. While it hasn't gained any points since 2006, it's a card that always has a chance of being reprinted, and it isn't completely out of the question that it would see some play. At number 5, it's Ink Eyes the Desecrator, which was at number 2 last time. This legendary rat costs 4 generic and 2 black, and it's a 5/4. When it deals combat damage to a player, you can put a creature card from that player's graveyard into play under your control. She can also regenerate for 1 generic and a black. She's also got ninjutsu for 3 generic and 2 black. Reanimating an opposing creature is a huge deal, and she can sneak in and do it with ninjutsu. Because she can regenerate even without ninjutsu, she's really annoying as an attacker that your opponent kind of always has to block, even though they probably can't kill her either. She gained all of her points in Kamigawa Block Constructed in the standard of 2005. At number 4, it's Lord Skitter Sewer King, the newest rat on the list. For 2 generic and a black, you get a legendary 3/3 rat, and when another rat enters the battlefield under your control, you can exile up to 1 card from an opposing graveyard, and at the beginning of combat on your turn, you create a 1/1 rat that can't block. Basically, Skitter gives you a solid body that hates on the graveyard and builds an army all on its own. That's pretty powerful, and as a result, despite only being a little over a month old, it's already number 4 on this list. So far, all the points have come in standard, most frequently in Esper Legends, a deck that can get some extra mileage out of Skitter's legendary status with cards like Iganjo and Plaza of Heroes. It's going to keep gaining points in standard, and I think it's pretty likely it finds some success in Pioneer at some point too. Skitter has a pretty good chance at eventually being the number 1 rat on this list. At number 3, it's Crypt Rats, which was at number 9 last time. For 2 generic and a black, you get a meager 1/1, but it has a pretty awesome activated ability. For X mana, it does X damage to all creatures and all players. You can only spend black mana on X. In other words, this rat can be a board sweeper and a potential win condition. It's awesome play in Mirage Block Constructed, but it's done the most by far in Pauper. There just aren't very many commons in existence that can impact the board as much as this can, and that's what's resulted in it seeing so much play there. At number 2, it's Gree Fang Okiba Boss, a rat that didn't even exist when I made the 2021 list. For 1 generic, a white, and a black, Gree Fang is a legendary 4/3, and at the beginning of combat on your turn, it reanimates a vehicle and gives it haste, then you return it to your hand at the beginning of your next end step. It's gained all of its points in a Pioneer deck called Gree Fang that can easily put powerful vehicles in the graveyard. The most impressive thing the deck can do is bring back Parhelion 2 on turn 3. Because it gives you 2 4/4 angels when it attacks, you get to hold on to those even after Parhelion gets bounced back to your hand. The deck has been a force in Pioneer since 2022, and while it isn't quite as dominant right now as it once was, Gree Fang decks are still putting up finishes in Pioneer events. It has an outside shot at passing the number 1 card on this list in the future, but for now, that card is Packrat, which was also at number 1 last time. While it's only gained 2 points in the last 2 years, its 52 points were still enough, by a whole lot, to come out on top. For 1 generic and a black, it's a star with power and toughness each equal to the number of rats you control. For 2 generic and a black, you can discard a card and put a token into play that's a copy of Packrat. Now obviously all the copies of Packrat are rats, and they also have this text box. This means that as soon as you start making copies of Packrat, it's going to be very difficult for your opponent to get things under control with anything other than a board sweeper. Things just snowball in a hurry, and oftentimes if you're the one playing the rat, it's better to just keep making copies of it until your opponent dies or plays a board sweeper, because that way you aren't committing any other resources to the board, and by using this ability once or twice every turn, you're adding a ton to it. Things get even sillier if you're getting extra value out of putting cards into your graveyard. Packrat was a dominant card in Standard. It saw the most play in Devotion to Black, but the rats were also played in Blue-Black and Orzhov control decks. They stayed idle for several years after rotating out of Standard, but the creation of Pioneer resulted in a bit of a resurgence. It was played as a sideboard card in Dimir Inverter decks. That was a combo deck, but it needed a sideboard plan for opponents who could disrupt their combo too easily, and Packrat is exactly that. Dimir Inverted decks got banned out of the format though, and Packrat hasn't gained Pioneer points since then. The 2 points it has gained since the last list came out came in Thassa's Oracle combo decks in Historic. It's hard to ever count Packrat out entirely, but it's definitely gaining points very slowly, especially compared to Gree Fang and Skitter, so it may not be number 1 if I revisit this list in 2 years. So, those are the top 10 rats in Magic. If you want to own any of these cards, check out the description where you can find a direct Card Kingdom link for each card that appeared in the video. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and share it. If you want to catch future videos, don't forget to subscribe. If you want to catch up on past videos, check out all the playlists, some of which you'll see on your screen shortly. Thanks for watching.